Gentle lady viewers and gentlemen viewers, good evening and welcome. Welcome to this, the first episode of a new series called Historical Sketches. Some viewers may recognize him who addresses them now, from the previous series which was called Shakespeare's Views on the News, as well as a talk show which was called Orwell Today. Now, there has been a lapse of time, a hiatus between this series. For one thing, there has been an acceleration of developments both on the national and the international scene. And so I decided to transfer the idea of Shakespeare's views on the news to a website. The website is called, has a title, www.yourdailysshakespeare.com, and is actually very well attended. It averages from 3,000 to 5,000 visits per month, and it deals with national and international events interpreted, if you like, through a Shakespearean lens and with a Shakespearean flavor. We will show the web address on and off during this show, as the plan is for the historical sketches to be also available online and to be watched at leisure if you are so interested. And I also plan to upload the historical sketches on the same website, www.yourdailysshakespeare.com. Now then, this being the first episode of a new series, a short introduction is called for. It is not the intent here to explain what you already know, or to undertake academic analysis of historiography, so to speak, but just a few notes. To start with, you do not need to be a historian to know what history is. Unlike, for example, with the computer language. You need to know the language of HTML that had the cryptic name hypertext markup language to assert that you are an HTML practitioner. But with history it is different. Our very life is a history. There is a history in all men's lives, figuring the natures of the times, disease, etc., as Shakespeare says. And what is the life of an individual, if not a collection of personal experiences? However, when it comes to history at large, opinions, as usual, vary. For some, history is simply a collection of basic facts, which appears logical, so logical as to almost sound like a platitude. But just one moment. That history is a collection of basic facts would be indeed a platitude if we all were agreed about what a historical fact actually is, which we unfortunately do not. For example, we all agree that there was a civil war in 1861, or that has been a violent change of government in Ukraine just now in February 2014. But these statements tell us very little about what went on in the Civil War in 1861 or in Ukraine today. And this is exactly what went on before, during and after a historical event is what we call the stuff of history. In other words, as an Italian playwright once said, a fact is like a sack. It won't stand up until you put something in it. Which then led the well-known German philosopher Nietzsche to say there are no facts but only interpretations. Consider for example the destruction of the World Center Towers on 9/11, and there are two sets of interpretation about the event. According to one set, the act of terror was organized by Saudi terrorists as a reprisal for the treatment of the Palestinians by Israel and for the support that the US gives to Israel itself. According to another set of opinions, the act of terror was a diabolical inside job planned and perpetrated to justify the occupation and or the destruction of foreign lands, as well as to carry out the so-called project for the American century, the PNAC. In other words, the raw fact, the fact in itself, cannot be disjoined, cannot be separated from its interpretations, which is what actually Nietzsche said. But there is also another important aspect of history that we don't think about during our busy lives. What makes a fact historical? Take, for example, the river, the Rubicon, the famous Rubicon. It is actually more of a seasonal torrent than a river, and it is less than 20 miles long. But it is a historian who decided, for his own reasons, that the Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon, of that petty stream, was in fact a fact of history. Whereas the crossing of the Rubicon by millions of other people before or since interests nobody at all. And that crossing has been continuously remembered for 2,000 years, as you can see in this 15th century miniature. And who was the historian? His name was Suetonius, who attributed to Caesar the famous sentence "Alea iacta est," the die has been cast, meaning that events have passed a point of no return, after which something inevitably will happen. And in fact, with that step, crossing the Rubicon, Caesar entered Italy at the head of his army in defiance of the Roman Senate, and began his long civil war against Pompey and against what today we would call the right wing of the Roman Senate. Therefore, the primary task of the historian is to select, to omit, and to ignore what does not fit with the ideas that he wishes to convey. Or, as the English writer Lytton Strachey said, ignorance is the first requisite of a historian. But, orderly to end where I began, as Shakespeare himself would say, to end this introduction, the intent of this series of historical sketches is to choose, at random, episodes that by necessity and by selection are ignored by the standard history books, but that nevertheless may be of some interest to those who may have themselves an interest in history, perhaps to show some unreported whims and the traits of a famous man, or some anecdotes and details of his adventures, his exploits, his successes, his defeats, his friends, and his enemies. For the first historical sketch of this series, I have chosen an unquestionably historical character that you will immediately recognize from this picture, namely Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor of the French. Here too, controversies abound. For some historians, Napoleon was the embodiment of the French Revolution. It was he who brought glory to France, whereas for other historians, it was he who brought France to disaster. But irrespective of what may be your point of view, often there is irony in history. In this instance, for example, in the instance of the revolution, the French found that it was necessary to cut the head of kings and nobles, but there was nothing wrong with an emperor. And in this sketch, we will only deal with one narrow time interval, namely what happened to Napoleon during the month immediately following the last battle where he was defeated at Waterloo in June 1815. We will follow him during the adventurous journey from the plains of what today is Belgium to the shores of the French Atlantic coast. And we will find out how it came about that instead of traveling to America, where he first planned to escape, he ended up in the remote island of British island of St. Helena, or of St. Helena as the British would call it, in the middle of the South Atlantic. And who are the characters in this historical sketch, besides Napoleon, that is? The first character which we will encounter is General Gaspard Gourgaud, whom you see here depicted in this dapper uniform. To him we owe much of the information concerning Napoleon after Waterloo, and he also accompanied Napoleon in his exile in St. Helena. He stayed in the island for 3 years, from 1815 to 1818, after which he left the island on a secret mission on behalf of Napoleon, but of this we may talk later. And who was Gaspard Gourgaud? He was the son of a musician in the king's private orchestra at Versailles, the castle of Versailles, the king being Louis XVI, the very one who, as you know, ended up beheaded on the guillotine in 1792. Gourgaud's mother was a nurse in the service of the Duke of Berry, and Gaspard Gourgaud grew up being a playmate of the Duke. And perhaps it was this association with the nobility that helped drive Gaspard to the famous École Polytechnique of Paris, and then to the equally famous artillery school. Gaspard participated in just about all the battles fought by Napoleon. He distinguished himself at Ulm, at the capture of Vienna, at Austerlitz, at Jena, at Friedland, and he saved the day in a critical spot in a battle near Ostrolenka, of all places, in Poland, between the French and the Russian army, and was promoted there for his bravery. He then fought in Spain, and later was in the north again at various other battles, including the Battle of Wagram and Leipzig. And during the Russian campaign of 1812, Gaspard Gourgaud was wounded. But still, it was he who first entered the Kremlin in Moscow and saved the life of Napoleon once by discovering and destroying a mine that was planted inside the very Kremlin and, of course, intended to kill Napoleon. For this, he was made a baron of the empire, and also due to his bravery in the terrible retreat from Russia that we have seen in various movies, he was appointed first orderly officer. After which, he received the Gold Star of the Legion of Honor, and in January 1814 he actually killed with a pistol a terrorist Cossack who was on the point of planting a dagger in the heart of Napoleon. And at Waterloo it was he, Gaspard Gourgaud, who fired the last shot from a French cannon in that fateful Sunday, in that fateful field at Waterloo. Baron Gourgaud was one of the restricted circle of people who were allowed to accompany Napoleon, as I said, in the island of St. Helena, as we will see later. And it is also understandable why Napoleon was attached to him. In fact, in St. Helena, Napoleon said of him, "He is my work, he is my son." But back to Napoleon after Waterloo, whose travel, or rather his escape, if you like, from Waterloo to the town of Rochefort on the southwest of the French Atlantic coast, whose travel, as I said, and whose adventures and indecisions read almost like a novel. Now, the Battle of Waterloo took place, as I said, on Sunday, June 18th, 1815, between Napoleon, who had just been restored to power after the 100 days exile in the Italian island of Elba, battle between him and the coalition forces. Now, today we would call these forces the coalition of the willing, and they included the British under the supreme command of the Duke of Wellington, the Dutch, the Prussians, and some other contingents from Germany. The battle was long, uncertain, and very bloody. We will not expand here on the battle itself. That would require a full program by itself. The outcome of the battle was uncertain until the end. In fact, at one point, the Cumberland Hussars, from a regiment from Hanover in Germany, fled the field, spreading the alarm as far as Brussels that Napoleon had won. But after the attacks, advances, and retreats on both sides, the Prussians eventually turned the tide, and one general of the coalition summed up the ending of the battle in his memoirs. He made reference to a farm which has since been reconstructed, as you can see in this image. The farm had been at the beginning the headquarters of Napoleon, and the German general says, in the middle of the position occupied by the French army, and exactly upon the height, is a farm called La Belle Alliance, the nice alliance. The march of all the Prussians, of the Prussian columns was directed towards this farm, which was visible from every side. It was there that Napoleon was during the battle. It was there that he gave his orders, that he flattered himself with the hopes of victory, and it was there that his ruin was decided. There too it was that, by happy chance, Field Marshal Blücher and the Lord Wellington met in the dark and mutually saluted each other as victors. Now, I invite the viewer to imagine this field of battle where the British had suffered 15,000 dead and wounded, the Prussians 7,000, and the French 25,000 casualties. Altogether, 47,000 dead and wounded soldiers lying in the field. Whatever remained of the French army fleeing towards France as best as they could, among them Napoleon himself with his small court of generals and guard. Imagine it. And the mention should also be made of the horses who were mercilessly shot at, either by accident or by design. Here is an image showing the charge of the Scots Grey as they called. And of course there are no accurate figures, but at least 2,000 horses were slain, were killed and left on the ground. For the record, the field of Waterloo was physically altered shortly afterwards. The hill on which stands the commemorative monument was built actually after the battle. In his book *Les Misérables*, the French writer Victor Hugo wrote, "By taking from this mournful field the wherewithal to make a monument to it, its real relief has been taken away, and history, disconcerted, no longer finds a bearing. It has been disfigured for the sake of glorifying it." One more related piece of information. Few would know that the banking family of the Rothschilds benefited significantly from the outcome of the Battle of Waterloo. The Rothschilds had their own information network. And once the results of the battles were certain, an agent left for London, and Nathan Rothschild sold all his stocks on the London exchange, causing a panic. a Black Friday of sorts. Traders assumed that Napoleon had won and the Rothschilds was protecting himself, so there occurred the equivalent of a Black Friday. But, as soon as Rothschild determined that prices could not fall any further, he immediately repurchased his and other stocks at a very low price. The news of the British victory at Waterloo reached London the next day. The stock had a surge and Nathan Rothschild made an immediate fortune, which may explain one famous quote of his that goes, "I care not what puppet is placed upon the throne of England to rule the empire on which the sun never sets. He who controls the money supplies controls the British Empire, and I control the British money supply." Advance the historical clock by 200 years. Instead of the British Empire, insert in the sentence the American Empire, and you may agree that the notion, the spirit, and the philosophy of Nathan Rothschild's quotation are preserved and maintained to the letter. Now, this was a long introduction to the actual historical sketch of this episode, namely how Napoleon managed to escape from Waterloo all the way to the Atlantic coast. But I thought you may be interested to know a little of the background of this notably historical event. Now here is again the map of the escape route taken by Napoleon and by his entourage. And we should add that at the time of Waterloo, Belgium was part of France, as the foundation of the current Belgian state came about in 1831. On the next day after the battle, that is June 19th, 1815, Napoleon reached the town of Charleroi, of which you see here today's main square. He then crossed the river Sambre, that you also see here, peacefully looked at by a group of retired fishermen. And Gourgaud, the faithful Gourgaud, tried to collect a small body of cavalry, but it was hard, as we may imagine what happens after such a tremendous defeat. There was the usual confusion of people escaping and creating a traffic jam. And also, there was the imminent danger that the light horse of the enemy may show up at any time. So instead of using a carriage, it was mandatory to just ride a horse for everyone, even for Napoleon. And for the record, at the Battle of Waterloo, in case of victory, the Prussians intended to hang Napoleon on the spot if they had caught him. Now, further along the escape route, in the little town of Rochefort that you see here, in a restaurant or pub, much like this one in the picture, less the car, of course, they had dinner. And Baron Gourgaud notes it down in his diary that the restaurant keeper made them pay 300 francs, which he thought was too expensive for what they got. After Rochefort, the little group reached the city of Reims, the ancient place where the kings of France were coronated in the magnificent Gothic cathedral that you see here. On the 20th of June, they had breakfast at the little town of Berry-au-Bac. You see here a town that suffered tremendous punishment during World War I. And here, that's why I mentioned Berry-au-Bac, Napoleon and his entourage had a conference or a consultation of sorts. And here the idea discussed was for Napoleon to go to Paris to present himself at the Chamber of Deputies, worn as he was and travel-stained. He would then ask to be put in charge of the still intact army of General Emmanuel de Grouchy, and if the Chamber of Deputies denied the request, Napoleon would resign the imperial crown, if that indeed would bring peace. The idea had been that the image of Napoleon, battle-worn and battle-stained, may have stirred the patriotic and national sentiment in the deputies at the chamber and help Napoleon to regroup. And here we may add a few notes about General Emmanuel de Grouchy, whom you see depicted here. The intention is to show how an unscheduled event can have the most unpredictable consequences, especially when a battle is involved. Earlier, before the actual start of the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon had sent Grouchy to pursue a part of the Prussian army that was retreating. But for whatever reason, Grouchy chased away the Prussians but was unable to close in with them. Then, despite hearing the cannon sound from nearby Waterloo, instead of to leave alone that section of the fugitive Prussians and return to reinforce the French, he decided to follow and try to catch the Prussians, just as he had been ordered. But in the meantime, the main Prussian army and the British-Dutch armies united to crush Napoleon. Still, Grouchy won a partial but smart victory over the Prussian corps, and he was ordered to chase them, but it was too late. And by the time this secondary battle was over, Napoleon had already lost at Waterloo. As far as the resistance was possible, after this great disaster, Grouchy made it. He gathered up the wrecks of Napoleon's army and retired swiftly and unbroken to Paris, where, after interposing his reorganized forces between the enemy and the capital, he resigned his command into the hands of another French marshal. For his action at Waterloo the accusation was levied against him of not having fought well at Waterloo, which is not true. He actually saved some of the French army for a possible salvage. But the French condemned him to exile in America. However, he returned in 1821, the same year when Napoleon died, and Grouchy was reinstated as a general. Now, the time is running short here, was running out rather, and I think we have to stop here at this first historical sketch, which has been taken by an introduction which may not happen other times. I want to thank the crew, particularly Kat Iverson, our director, thank the viewers who have watched us, and as I said, they can see the program online by connecting to www.yourdailysshakespeare.com. So thank you again, see you next time, and good night.